Cybersecurity concerns are ever evolving. OT cybersecurity is even more complex, and it's so much more than just software and hardware. How do you stay on top of it all? Aaron Crow has over 25 years experience with cybersecurity, 15 of those years focused on operational technology across multiple industries, and he wants to help you. Welcome to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast, brought to you by Industrial Defender. Now here's your host, Aaron Crow.
All right, excited. We actually did a little pre-work on this one, so why don't you introduce yourself, tell the audience who you are, what's your background, and all the important fun stuff.
Fantastic, and thanks for having me on the show today, Aaron. So my name's Kayne McGladrey. I am the field CISO for Hyperproof. I am also a senior member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, the IEEE, you might have heard of us as, and I'm one of their spokespeople for cybersecurity. I've been doing this for over 25 years now in cybersecurity. This is my second time being a CISO. My first time was in the Defense Industrial Base, working at a manufacturing and design company. And what else can I say about myself? I live in Bellingham, Washington, the city of subdued excitement up in the Pacific Northwest. And who knows, maybe we'll be lucky. My cat might stop by on the show. He's an occasional guest that shows up. He's a Norwegian forest cat. So if you like large cats, yeah, he's definitely got that going on.
Well, hopefully we'll get lucky and he'll jump into screen at some point. So why don't we dive in and, what are the recent things that you guys are working on? Obviously, IEEE is very keen on, I know necessarily your background is in OT, but all of these things are intermingled with the IEEE and OT and IT and cybersecurity and how all these things are coming together and emerging to be all one thing that really revolves around the business risk and understanding what's going on in these spaces, right?
Yeah, and I love that you phrased it as business risk, because that's one of the things that I'm trying to convince CISOs of. There's no such thing as cyber risk. Like, it's been a fiction that technology people who came up from the IT backgrounds that we've created, and that doesn't resonate with board members. It doesn't resonate with a executive leadership. And I think as we start to change our narrative to be, we are advising on business risks. And
right.
There's a few things to unpack there, right? I'm saying we're advisory. We are not, like, at no time do I feel, this is an opinion, that CISOs should necessarily be the person who's making a call, who's making a determination of this is the way that we're going to manage this risk, because often we're not the business owner for a risk. I think we need to really have the business understand these are the risks we face: operational technology, information technology, business risk, regulatory risks, legal risks, etc. And then we can advise within our remit for what we can do. But also, when we think about risks at a very high level, we need to ensure that we are framing them up so that the board cares, right? I think we've all given the spotlight or the red, yellow, green chart with 50 blinking lights that nobody actually ever understands as a board level presentation. I don't think that people want that anymore. And so if we can take our key risk indicators that we're tracking as CISOs, our KRIs, and really line and cover those to key performance indicators, KPIs, that are actually being used to measure the performance of the business or individual executives within the business, I think that we're going to have a much easier conversation around applying compensating controls or mitigating controls or transference than if we just say, oh, we're doing technology for technology's sake, because that never really was intended to work, and it's not going to work today.
Yeah, and I see that a lot in coming from the business side and from an asset owner or a plant manager or whatever that is, right? Is I'm pushing on, hey, I've got these things and it does all this stuff. And they're like, I've been running this plant for 40 years and I've never seen that be a problem. So tell me why I want to bring in this thing that's going to cost me more money. It's going to be harder to do my job. It's not going to make my process more efficient. It's not going to help me be more efficient. What is the benefit to me as an asset owner, as a business owner, as a board member for doing this stuff if there's not something that ties back to being more efficient or avoiding some really big negative thing like compliance or regulation or fines or any of those types of things? And I agree with you 100%. It's all got to be wrapped back into the business thing, because that's all that matters.
Mm-hmm. And we are seeing that convergence really happen where companies are, companies are being regulated into certain behaviors that previously, I think that market regulators have tried to take a light touch. Now, anybody in the financial services industry who's listening is going to be screaming at the podcast right now. And I'm sorry, I know fintech you all get heavily regulated, but for the rest of the industries that are represented in the world, especially like in manufacturing, because I spent some time there in the defense industrial base, like there's not a lot of guidance that happens, and you really have to tie it back to what are the risks that are facing our business today. And if you have that alignment on what are those risks, is it a comprehensive risk treatment, and is it actually written down? Like if you're thinking about operational efficiency, like if you have a plant slowdown that is going to reduce your production capabilities by 10%, okay, you still haven't got to the business risk there. What you got there is you've got a business problem that you're losing money because the thing that you make, you can't make anymore. And I think where CISOs have failed in that, in a lot of cases, is that we'll say, well, ransomware. And we missed, like, no, the narrative there is if you're dealing with a ransomware incident, your staff are going to be dealing with it. And as a consequence, you're going to have degraded manufacturing capabilities in this plant that is affected by a ransomware event. If we phrase things in that terminology, I think we get a lot better outcomes when we're having those conversations with other business leaders. But the other thing we always have to be plumbing for is preparation, not just for litigation, not just for compliance, not just for reinsurance or insurance reapplications, but for kind of all of the above, right? If we aren't designing our controls in such a way, whether they're operational technology, information technology, financial controls, don't care. If you don't have a way to do regular inspection in a lightweight, non-adversarial fashion of collecting, like, hey, this control is actually in place and it's actually working and it's working regularly, you're going to have a bad time when your insurance provider says, so you say you've got multi-factor authentication on all your folks, prove it. Or when you have an insurance, like after the fact, when they're trying to deny a claim that you've made, where they're going to ask you for the exact same thing, or you're going for an ISO certification for your manufacturing processes or for your cybersecurity processes, there is going to be a level of evidence that you are required to present. And I think that the days of panicking because the auditor is coming, so let's all panic organizationally for 4 weeks to try and bin up, or in some cases just create out of nothing evidence of compliance, I don't think that's a long-term sustainable business strategy.
Yeah, and I see that a lot, and you hit a whole bunch of topics there that we can dive into. But on compliance side, right? You see a lot of this in IT and OT and all the different places where a lot of these things are manual, and same thing. An audit's coming, so you're scrambling to go try to find or create the evidence stream that you can hand over, where it should have been done automatically as soon as you were doing the things. That way, you're selecting print and handing it to them. Here you go, Mr. Auditor. There's all the evidence that you were looking for. And that goes towards insurance and all the things that you just talked about. And what if you did that? How much more effort could you spend on other things? Like you're not taking all of your staff and your people and your resources and your teams to fight for this month of gathering equipment and evidence and logs and making sure that you've crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's, and all of that means they're not doing other things. They're not focused on defending the environment and responding to remediations and doing the normal jobs that they're doing. They're 100% focused on this exercise that takes them out of their normal operations.
But the other thing that you get there is you get a competitive advantage from a go-to-market perspective. And something that I've encouraged CISOs to do is go make friends with sales. Like go make friends with your go-to-market team. And I say that because they're the folks who are going to be dealing with security questionnaires. They're the folks who are going to be sending you security questionnaires. And the first rule of security questionnaires is if you wait for somebody to ask you to fill it out, you're going to get a 1,200 question SIG. And then they're going to ask you for your SOC 2 Type 2, and they're going to conflate that with a certification, which just makes my head hurt a little bit. Instead, I think we really need to, if we phrase up cybersecurity as a business imperative, but also as a strategic advantage, what of all those evidence that you and I have just discussed, what of that can we use to go get a certification, to actually go get something that differentiates us in our marketplace, that our sales team can say, here is our cybersecurity stance. So instead of waiting for the inevitable unwanted security questionnaire, we get out ahead of it and say, hey, look, you need our ISO 27001 certification. Boom, there you go. Let's move on, right?
Right.
Rather than having these protracted negotiations. But also that same evidence can be used when we're talking to our insurance provider, right? And I can think of cases where there's been poor alignment between go-to-market, between the CISO and between insurance, where there's a giant deal that hinges on having a certain level of cyber insurance coverage. You don't want to find that out on day 30 of the quarter when the deal has to close and go-to-market comes to you and says, hey, could you raise our cyber insurance limit to like $10 million from whatever it is currently? Like, if we don't have that visibility into business processes today, it's going to come back and hurt us. And I can guarantee if you've got a go-to-market team that's sourcing those deals, it's not going to look good on the CISO if they weren't prepared for it, or if they're the reason that a deal fell through because of a lower insurance coverage. So we really do, as CISOs, have to be effective communicators, but also look at what of our work can we reuse in new and innovative ways so that we're not creating work for the sake of work, or that we have the perspective of like you're just doing checkbox compliance rather than actually creating a business advantage.
Not to mention, in that scenario you just talked about, right, is when you're trying to go get insurance when you need it and you're dependent upon it, they're going to know that, and your rates are not going to be, in the right place. And they know they've got you. Like you have to get this. I've got this deal. I've got to get it done. Let's fast track this. They've got you right where they want you. Whereas if you're doing in advance and you're planning that with your go-to-market strategy and your team, you're doing that in advance. You've got time. You're not stressed. You can shop around. There's all sorts of advantages you get to that. And all this comes back to business risk. It comes back to my cost of doing business. What is my EBITDA? Like, all of those things tie into this, and it's not just hey, this nation state is trying to attack us. Like that's what gets in the news, and that's what the cyber technology people are focused on. And when they knock on the CISO's door, like, aren't you concerned about ransomware and China and all of the nation state and the APTs and all this stuff? But they're not talking about this. They're not talking about how is it going to hurt your bottom line? How is it going to impact your operations, your business process, your sales team? Like, that's a good one that never gets talked about.
Or rarely gets talked about. I think that forward-looking CISOs really are becoming consummate communicators. And, you go have coffee or go have drinks with legal, right? Like, the last time as a CISO you want to be meeting your chief counsel is during a breach, because the first thing you're going to think about is, I guess I'm going to go update LinkedIn after this call or this meeting because I see where this is going, right? That's the wrong attitude to have towards legal. Or go have a good coffee with your chief financial officer. And I say that because CFOs, like, if you want to talk about control design, not control effectiveness, but control design. They've been dealing with Sarbanes-Oxley for 20 plus years now, right?
Yeah.
That has a penalty of going to club fed. So if you want to really understand, like, are my controls designed sensibly? Go talk to your CFO. They actually understand, like, what good control design looks like. Be friends with the go-to-market team, as I said earlier, so that we can source those things earlier, those risks to a deal, those risks to the business, but also to find out, like, what are they dealing with? What is a competitive advantage we could position our cybersecurity as, whether that's something like getting an ISO certification or maybe creating a different program that's requested in your specific marketplace or your industry that's going to differentiate you as a vendor or supplier, instead of like, oh, we're generic vendor ABC, and yes, we'd love to fill out your questionnaire, because first of all, you wouldn't, and second of all, what's the message there, folks? Like, if you're not differentiating yourself by managing your risks effectively, I can't imagine that third-party risk management conversations are going to go very well.
Yeah, and the controls thing you talked about there, right, is controls, whether they're CFO controls or whatever those controls are. We want to pretend like we in the cyber world, I'm doing the air quotes here, but we in the cyber world want to talk about like our controls are some magic thing that we created, and they're so complex, but they're just controls, right? They're just frameworks. They're just ideas of how do I communicate. The whole point of 62443 and NIST and CSF and all this stuff is so that you and I can have a conversation and we're using the same language, right? It's about putting it in a box so we can all say, when I say a 4, this is what that 4 means. And when I say a 3, this is what that 3 means. And how do we build a program that's sustainable? And when I've gone through this with a lot of, being a consultant, I've done this for a lot of large organizations, small organizations, and their default many times seems to be, well, I need to be a 5 in everything. No, like that's first, it's not attainable, and second, that shouldn't be your goal. Like that's not what a successful program and controls looks like. It should be, there's going to be manual stuff, there's going to be automated stuff, and you're going to have way more 3s and 2s than you're probably going to have 5s. Like, if you have any 5s, it's going to be rare, and it's going to be something that you're extremely good at, and is just happening in the background, and it's just magic, right?
Yeah, yeah. And prior to joining Hyperproof, actually, I was doing executive advisory work for global businesses, Fortune 500, the usual suspects. And one of the things that I found consistently is that companies would prioritize controls numerically. And that's silly because, like, if you've got control number one and then control number two and then control, you don't have to do control number one first. Like, that's just a numbering system that's not actually meaningful. So
Sure.
what we often did was we'd actually look at what is the threat level and what's the threat actor engagement, whether that's a review of SIM, a review of dark web telemetry, or any other telemetry we could actually get our hands on to say, where are you actually most likely to get hit? Right? Let's go bolster that control, that defense, that part of the business first before going to cover off on other things. At Hyperproof, we're actually doing a FedRAMP initiative right now, led by my good friend Tom, who, when I was offered by our chief operating officer, like, hey, would you like to do FedRAMP again? I was like, nope. I'm perfectly fine. I have enough gray hair as it is. And Tom is leading that in the recognition that to get to FedRAMP moderate, we have to do all the controls, but not all the controls make sense to go do first. Right? As a certification, you have to be able to prove that you're doing all of them. But if one is going to have a material effect, a positive effect on the business, choose those controls first to develop the policies and the procedures, and then the actual control implementation, and put the other ones off for a while, because what we're doing is we're then effectively reducing risk, which is a lot of what CISOs end up doing, is figuring out how do we advise the business. Not how do we, but how do we advise the business owners on how we can reduce our risk, and how can they then approve that and make that a business case for, oh, we're getting FedRAMP moderate, which means we'll be able to sell to this type of client. So they understand we're doing this for a reason, and it also has the knock-on effect of reducing our threat level or reducing our risks in addition to attaining a certification. But like I say, when I was doing EA work, executive advisory work for companies, that was a foreign concept. They thought, like you said, like, oh, well, we want to be kind of a 3. Because we don't want to be a 1, because we realize the person who's at the back of the pack gets eaten by the zombies. But we also don't want to be a 5 on account of that's really stupidly expensive, and we don't want to spend that much. So we kind of want to blend in. And I think that if you have that macro level, that's fine. But there are going to be areas where you have to be a lot stronger. And it's entirely based on either the countries that you're operating in, the industries that you're operating in, the litigatory and regulatory framework that's currently in place around you, and finally, like, what are the threat actors doing? Because that's the other bit. I think that's the one bit around business that people struggle with, is the level of innovation in the field right now. Like, if you think of a traditional insurance type, like, I don't know, fire, for example, right? Companies have been successfully managing the business risk associated with fire. Insurance companies have been successfully dealing with the business risks of fire, because we've had fire for how long has Earth existed precisely? Because I think we've had fire for that long. And people have kind of figured out, like, this is what can happen with fire. And the actuaries have got those maths. It's not creating, there's no cycle, there's no economic incentive to come up with a new type of fire. And I think in the cyber realm, that is one of those distinctions where there are economic imperatives for threat actors to essentially figure out, how do we monetize our skill set? And that's whether it's for nation state surveillance or whether it's for criminal activity, criminal based on Western jurisdiction, not other regions' jurisdictional laws, right? Where that becomes a communications point that sometimes we over-rotate into in the cyber. And it just comes down to a business risk. Like, we have a certain sphere of risk that we are controlling. There is always going to be perpetual new risk that we might have to deal with. So how do we at least have visibility into that? And how does that get encapsulated, like you said, into our business risk register, where we're evaluating, like, how are we talking about this? Do we all agree on what this is? And do we agree on the importance of it before we go to control selection, or, goodness help us, technology selection, to say, well, we might have some APT crew that might do a thing, so let's go spend a whole bunch of money. It's not going to work. It's just, you're not going to get the funding.
Unfortunately, I think we've both probably seen it a lot of times where we choose the technology before we even classified the risk and decided what we're going to do as an organization, or tied it to a business risk. We say, hey, I saw something in the news and there was a target attack or Colonial Pipeline or whatever the thing is that they saw. I don't want that to happen to us, so let's go buy this widget that stops that, right? And how does that integrate with our system and our process and our people, process, and technology, and where does that sit? Who's owning it? I don't know. Let's just put it in because it's cool.
Yes, I think we have both seen that, and we both know exactly how poorly that goes. And I think the solution to that is coming in 2024 with budgetary reductions, where business owners are really going to have to look at the controls that they're operating and say, first of all, is this actually managing my risk anymore? Like,
Right.
is this related to my risk? Is that risk still even valid? And if so, is the control functional? Is it actually operating? Is it effectively reducing our risk? Or is there something that we could do, whether a manual process or whether a different vendor's process, to replace it? Because the other thing we're going to see, I think, is market consolidation. We're starting to see that in cybersecurity today, where the
Mm-hmm.
number of vendors is going to go down. And so you might get more favorable terms if you can get into a consolidated package and then say, well, instead of having 15 bespoke cybersecurity solutions, why don't we reduce that to 5 and just go with a platform play for the remainder, where it's going to give us the value that we need, but at a lower price point?
Yeah, and not only lower price point from a licensing perspective, but management and training my people and all of the things rolled into one, instead of, it's very easy to look at the capital upfront cost of something and how much does it cost per seat or per license or per year, or however the license structure is set up. But it's really hard, and many times I see it forgotten, is that tail, that O&M tail of, okay, I stood it up, now what? Who's going to manage it? How many people do I need? Like all of that other thing. How do I get value out of it? How do I show that it's reducing my risk, and what are those KPIs and all those things? It's like it's a different team that does it, but they don't do a transition. They don't do a handoff, and the team that gets handed it, they're like, wait, what is this? What are we doing with this?
Yeah.
Who set this up? Like, shouldn't I have been part? I'm confused.
Yeah, and I think also that ultimately creates division within animosity between the audit team or the risk team and risk committee
Right.
and the operational team that's actually operating the solution. And I don't think that anybody who got into like the field of auditing or risk management decided that they wanted to chase people for a living, right? That they wanted to ask somebody for a screenshot for a living, or for an
Right.
Excel file or a PDF file. And I think the people who got into cybersecurity, like, we've got 11 billion things to do at all times, and we probably don't have enough time. So when the auditor or the risk team comes around and says, hey, could you send us a thing that shows that the control's actually working? That's not, like, it's not going to come up in your performance review
Right.
that you were nice to the audit team. That's not going to come up in terms of your compensation structure. That's not going to defend the business more. And I think what we've unfortunately forgotten is that computers can copy files. Like, it turns out you can actually automate that stuff. And so I think for a lot of our controls, that if we're purchasing a new control or if we're evaluating an existing control, is it observable? Like, do
Right.
we have an automated means by which we can show the business that this is actually reducing our risk? Because if we do that, then as a cybersecurity professional, one of the hardest things to do on your annual performance review is talk to a business person about, here's how I effectively, like, made a positive difference. You can say, I defeated 1 million attacks, and they're going to go, and?
Right.
Like, I finished my project on time. Sure, fine, whatever. How do you differentiate yourself in the marketplace? And it comes down to, how do you effectively, the systems that you were operating, and this is whether you're an individual operator of an individual system or whether you're the CISO, don't care. Can you show, here is how effectively my work contributed to reducing the business risk, and have facts associated with that for your positive impact, rather than a subjective opinion that can be argumented. If you argumented. Woo! More coffee for me today, please. But if you've got that ability to show risk reduction and potential harm reduction on a regular basis, and it doesn't cost you anything more in terms of your day, why not do that to show
Yeah.
the positive impact that you're having, rather than, well, I finished my project on time and it was fun, and what that is not the way to go negotiate yourself a raise or a promotion. That's a way to just kind of keep on doing the same old, which I don't think a lot of cybersecurity professionals really look forward to that.
No, and it really gets back to, talking and selecting, technologies. And when I'm doing a side-by-side comparison, am I looking at, hey, how many, things can it do? The main thing of blocking attackers or malware or whatever the thing is. But that's not a thing that normally, many times, somebody is looking when they're writing the requirements of what the stuff needs to do, whatever the capability is. That should be part of that. Like, not only can it block an attacker, but can I show the value to a business person? Because to your point, it could be the best thing in the world at blocking attackers, but if I can't show proof to my CISO when it comes, or the CFO, when it comes to redo the budget. Am I going to continue paying for that thing? I have to be able to show not just that I blocked a million things, but what is the KPI? What are those translated to business? How is that valuable to me? And that, so I want to keep it going. Do I want to do more of that and not replace it for something cheaper, or just do nothing because you didn't show me any value that to the business that it was defending? So it was just a cost that I don't see value in.
Yeah, and I think also, like as a CISO, I have a stack of single panes of glass in my office,
Sure.
right? Every vendor is selling a single pane of glass.
Sure.
I do not want your specific single pane of glass.
Right.
And a good example of like why I would prefer to have a concerted like observability platform for my risks, for my controls. A friend of mine is a CISO, and they had a risk that was in their business risk register. So that said, we are worried about data exfiltration and litigation and regulatory problems associated with that. And they had some specific math, right? High, medium, low, that sort of qualitative stuff.
Sure.
But the risk was they're worried about their stuff leaking. Okay, cool. And they had a control, and the control that they'd linked to it, they'd actually made an explicit linkage. Like the control is we have enterprise grade firewalls that have got data loss prevention, and they prevent network-based attacks and all the things you'd kind of expect a firewall to do.
Sure.
And the firewall vendor, as part of their pitch for renewals, showed how many attacks they were blocking and that the firewall was doing firewall-y things. And if you're a CISO looking at that with your blinders on, you go, well, that's a cool technology. But this CISO, the friend of mine, said, well, wait a second, what's in my office these days? Because after COVID, they put in a work from home policy, and it's never changed. And so he looked at what was in his office buildings, and it was really nice enterprise grade access points and maybe some custodial staff occasionally. And that was it. Like, they're trying to get rid of their real estate. So the business risk is data exfiltration. The control is these enterprise firewalls that, from a firewall perspective, from their pane of glass, sure, that totally mitigates the risk that unfortunately isn't there anymore. So that's one where you have to go back to your business risk committee or your audit committee, depending on how your governance structure is set up, and talk to them and say, look, so the risk is still there, but the control doesn't make sense anymore, and it's because of a policy change. And what he was able to do in this case is, and I'm sure he did not make the enterprise grade firewall sales vendor's day, he was able to say, no, we're not going to spend $50 million on a renewal. It doesn't make any business sense, because he'd lined and covered back to the business of, here's the business risk. All folks are working from home now. The control does not cover people working from home. Right. We need to take some of that savings and put it into effective controls that will mitigate the risk of data exfiltration from people working from home and from remote locations, and take the rest of the business savings and give it back.
Right.
How often does a CISO go find $50 million under the couch cushions?
Right.
But the only way you get there is if you have direct ties. Here are the risks. Here are the risks we've all agreed upon. Here are the controls. Here's how effectively these controls are actually reducing those risks. And if something stops effectively reducing a risk, or if you can't measure it, get rid of that control, because it's not going to survive adversarial engagement. And that's whether it's with your board asking you, hey, could you save us some money next year? Whether it's your insurance company asking for proof that you were doing the thing you said you were doing in your insurance, or whether it's a breach investigation where a plaintiff is asked via discovery for facts associated with how well you were operating your controls. If you can't observe a control operating, it's probably not worth keeping around, especially in today's litigatory environment.
Yeah, and you hit on something really key there as well, is re-looking, right? With the open eye and willingness to change your mind, right? Hey, firewalls are great. I love firewalls. I'm a firewall guy, having them in, but when you sent people home, their data is no longer going through that firewall. So as great as that firewall is, it's not helping the control. So you have to be willing to say, yes, it was good when we put them in, but it's not fixing the problem now. So how else can we fix that problem? And be willing to adjust, not just get tied up on, I really like this technology and this blinky light or firewall or whatever it is, because if it's not fixing the problem, I mean, we see all the time how many CISOs are changing and rotating and going from this place to that, or getting fired or getting sued. Lots of things going on, right? With the CISOs signing their name, especially in other countries where they're being personally held liable for these security policies. So you better start looking at these things and make sure you understand what those risks are, and be willing to call an audible, like give back that 50 million, adjust, get away from firewalls or whatever not to beat up on firewalls, but whatever the thing is, to make sure that you are really covering that risk the way that you signed that you are.
Yeah, and also making sure that you understand who signed off on it. Like, I don't think in most cases a CISO is the person who signs off on a risk.
Right.
I think there's been a false narrative that has happened in business that the reason we hire CISOs is so they can sign off on risks, and
Right.
that's not what the profession is.
Right.
We can advise the business on risk. We can help a business owner design controls to mitigate that risk or decide whether, hey, you should transfer that risk if it has a cyber element. But that's not our necessarily, like, we're not going to say that. And especially in today's environment where CISOs often don't have directors and officers insurance, D&O insurance. And if
Right.
you're listening to this and you don't know what D&O insurance is and you're a CISO, consider changing jobs right now. We'll wait, because you're in a bad spot, right? The CISOs can be personally held liable for their decisions. And if you are not on the D&O policy, you're going to not have any corporate protection, which that's just all the bad time, which makes you start wondering, like, who actually wants to be a CISO these days, right?
Right.
Like, you get personal liability for shareholder suits that is potentially unlimited liability from, practical perspective, which you either have to insure against yourself or you have to decide, okay, well, I'm going to fight the board to actually be on the D&O or whoever's in charge of it.
Mm-hmm.
Or alternatively, you have to go, okay, well, maybe I don't want to do this anymore. I saw a report that said 75% of CISOs in 2024 are considering changing jobs, and some of us are going to be leaving CISO roles because of that risk that we have just for doing our day job.
Yeah.
I think that the new SEC rules are continuing to be very prescriptive over what they expect cyber programs to be, and if a CISO finds himself in a regulated industry where public industry, or in some cases, a supply chain of a public industry, they really have to look at this and say, do I have the executive connections? Am I friends with enough people? Do we actually have alignment on how we're going to do these things to actually continue to do my job effectively in today's regulatory and litigation climate? Or is now the time to say, well, that was fun, I'm going to go do something else? And I think the problem becomes if that becomes the narrative where a lot of people are like, yeah, I'm done, bye, not going to do the CISO thing anymore, which a lot of people are starting to choose.
Yeah.
That becomes troubling because we lose a lot of institutional knowledge.
Yeah.
And we lose a lot of experience. And I think that becomes then a risk to businesses that don't have succession plans. Like,
Yeah.
a lot of other executive positions, you've got a succession plan. CISOs, I think it was the Hendricks and Struggles report that like 30% of companies only have got a CISO succession plan. Right. And you figure, like, CISOs leave jobs about every 2 years.
Yeah.
How can you not have a transition or a succession plan in place? That just feels like, again, a problem that we have, a lot of companies have been ignoring to their own risk.
Yeah. And it's almost sad and funny, or whatever way you want to look at it, that something so important as that role, that CISO role, and advising on these cyber risks across your organization and providing that knowledge, and you don't think about that, right? You're not putting that, you're not giving them, you're not empowering them to be successful. You're not empowering your organization to be successful, and you're not thinking about that. And it's a, I don't know, sometimes it's a miss and a misunderstanding of how important those things are. And as we see more and more things that are brought into the cyber realm, that role has gotten, over the last 10 to 20 years, more and more important, right? Maybe this role, maybe it's old thinking and it wasn't as important before, but everything has a cyber twist on it. Like, you should be looking at every risk and what is the cyber impact of it, because everything is digitized, everything's going through a system, everything is integrated. I've got third party. I mean, again, look at the Target attack, right? It wasn't Target that was the problem. It was their vendor, right? It was the vendor was the way in. And so you have to be looking at all of those things, and understanding and classifying and categorizing and prioritizing all of those risks and signing up on them. But if you're not empowering that person in that role in that organization to do those things, you're going to have all of these unknowns, these things, these dark spots or assumptions, where it's going to end up coming back and biting you and the organization and the shareholders, and end up in the news and all the things that you don't want to happen as an organization.
Yeah. A good friend of mine actually was recently looking for a job as a CISO, and he'd finished final conversations, final interviews, was getting into negotiations, and they matched on salary. It was 7 figures. He was not afraid to share that with me.
Sure.
They matched on location, that he was going to be able to work primarily from home, though he had to be in the office like once a month or something like that.
Right.
And then it's a question of who am I reporting to, and he would have been reporting to the director of IT, who reported to the vice president of IT, who reported to the CIO, and he was going to have a job title CISO.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, yeah, no, I'm done. I'm not interested. Why? Well, I am not actually empowered. I am a CISO, a C-level executive in name only,
Right.
with no actual authority. And I think that that's something we're going to start seeing as the CISO profession continues to evolve, where some of us have been arguing for a long period of time. We want a seat at the table, right?
Right.
We will bring a folding chair if we have to. We want to be in the room.
Right.
We don't want to have a CIO controlling our budget. We
Right.
want to be able to have our own wherewithal. I think with some of the most recent regulatory changes that have happened, we're getting what we wanted, and that's going to drive people to go, okay, am I prepared for that level of a conversation? Am I
Right.
ready to take that on and to have that level of, first of all, understanding of what it is I do around here? I'm not the guy who fixes the network,
Right.
and I'm not the guy who like screws down the risk management system and does like, I'm not involved in like day-to-day incident response. Maybe I might work with an incident commander, but I'm not that person.
Yeah.
Like if you don't have that foundational understanding and you've got a poor reporting structure, again, a lot of CISOs find themselves in that unwanted space of they're functionally the bag man, the
Yeah.
person who's going to be left holding the bag. Not a great place to be. So again, if you're listening to this and find yourself going, oh wow, that sounds like my job. I hear LinkedIn is popular. You might want to go like consider your other options, because it's not going to get any easier. Like this job is only going to continue evolving, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Like I think a lot of us get into this because we like learning new things, but we have to be willing for those things not necessarily to be technical
Yeah.
things that we're ending up learning.
Yeah, and the technical side is there, but as you, just like with anything, as you get higher in the organization, you're less and less technical. You're less and less hands-on. That obviously you need to understand the technology side of things to be able to have those conversations and truly be able to categorize and understand and convert that technical thing to a risk on the business side. But that's more of the skill set, right? But same thing with you. Like I have multiple friends that have changed roles, been CISOs, and both sides, from being in that not VP, not at the table, fighting for budget, fighting for justification, being, today I'm underneath the IT side, tomorrow I'm underneath legal, and all of those implications and struggles where they just put their hands up like, look, if you're not going to empower me to do my job, then you don't want me to do my job, and I'm going to go find someplace else, because I'm not going to be sit here as the bag man when something bad happens and you point the finger at me when the whole time I've been telling you this and I have no power to actually do anything about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other thing that's really been interesting is the number of whistleblower claims that have come out this year in 2023 is higher than in any prior years. And I think about that, especially with the defense industrial base and with the recent, moves towards CMMC as a formal certification and attestation of capabilities there when doing business with the Department of Defense. And they have whistleblower provisions in there where, in theory, that might unfortunately be a way that a lot of CISOs have had to go. And we saw that in the, it's like Aerojet Rocketdyne, which sounds like the most generic company name ever. But anyway, their CISO was told to attest, to like sign his name to say that they had implemented their security controls. And the security controls, like, I think it was like a biometric scanner or something, it was in the box on the loading dock.
Right.
Right. And he said, no, I'm not going to sign this. Ended up doing a whistleblower claim to say, look, this is a FCA issue here. I don't want to end up dealing with this where I am being directed to sign something that is materially false.
Yeah.
Right. I think that we may see a number of CISOs that are covered by FAR or DFARS regulations where that's going to be their outlet. And it's an unfortunate way because it's probably also going to end their careers.
Yeah.
Right. I know recruiters, it used to be like if you were a CISO who had a breach, that was like the end. You were done. These days, I have friends who are recruiters, and they look for CISOs with breach expertise who have actually been to that very unpleasant rodeo. I do not think we're going to end up looking for CISOs with whistleblowing expertise or
Right.
that in their background, because companies are going to look at that and say, no, you're damaged goods.
Yeah.
We do not want you managing our risks because you yourself are a risk. But it comes to that alignment. Like, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. You don't get to a spot where somebody is being told to attest to something that is materially false and has legal consequences without there being poor level understanding of what does a CISO do?
Right.
Like, we're not the person who's signing off on that. That's a business risk. Somebody else should have owned
Yeah.
that particular risk and have attested to it. The CISO is like, we're not under the new SEC rules. They've been compared to Sarbanes-Oxley. They're not. We're not getting sent to Club Fed, thank
Right.
goodness, yet, touch wood. But at the same time, there is that component of risk that is increasing for our profession where we have to start to spread that around, right? And make sure the business owns their parts of it, not just continue treating us as the bag man.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, like, you can't sign off on business risk. It's not your business. It's not your risk to sign on. Like, you don't have authority or the ability to adjust that. Yes, you can advise, but how can you sign off on something that you don't own or control, right? And that's the ironic thing of this, right? Is it's just not in your, no more than you would get your plumber to sign off on your mechanic's work, right? It's just like, why would you do that? Like, you wouldn't. Like, your plumber would be like, okay, whatever. Why do you want me to sign this? It means nothing because I have no idea what he did. Like, why are you asking me this question?
That's funny. I was talking to one of our product managers at Hyperproof earlier this week, and he'd seen a product announcement from another vendor in our space of GRC, and it was around how they could use artificial intelligence to build a business risk register, and then to evaluate the risks of the impact and the probability of those. And then it was even via AI going to assign those risks to business owners. Who in their right mind is going to say, I'm going to have ChatGPT, because that's probably what it is on the back end,
Sure.
write up your business risks and then assign like values to it, and then finally who owns those risks? Like, who's going to say, yeah, that looks cool. Yeah, an AI with no context on my business came up with this generic looking risk that I'm somehow going to be responsible for? I don't see that as being a good outcome that anybody's going to actually subscribe to, but you're seeing that level of, at least like one level, I like them trying the idea of like, let's get a business risk register, but I don't think having an AI write one for you is necessarily the right strategy, and certainly not doing the assignments of ownership associated with that. Like, that's just crazy talk at that point.
Yeah, that's the difference between, using AI and saying, hey, write me an article about OT cybersecurity. And that's the prompt, and whatever it spits out, like, yeah, I'm going to publish that. Versus, hey, here's all my experience and my knowledge and all the things. I want you to clean it up and make sure it looks good to be published on social media, right? Those are two different things. The analogy you just gave is, just roll the dice. Make me a risk register. I don't know what it is. Like, you don't know what my business is. Just give me something. Like, I need something here, and I don't know where to start, right? It's asinine to think about. Unfortunately, how many businesses will do that, right? How many businesses will lean on that because they don't have that knowledge and or a better way to do it. So, and they're not hiring an EY or a McKinsey or whomever to come in and help them with those things. So I'll just go to ChatGPT.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other problem that we have going to technical people is I've also seen business risk registers. One of my favorite, I asked them how many risks they had in their register, and they had just over 3,000. And I kind of went, okay, so you're not a multinational business with that many divisions. How did you get to 3,000? And they'd basically taken their vulnerability scanner and dumped it into the risk register. And you go, okay, sorry, no, that is not a risk.
Those are vulnerabilities.
Yes, there is a difference. They don't even rhyme.
Right.
I think that business risks have to be high level enough and really focus on the impacts rather than necessarily on the how, because the how is always going to vary. The actual impact that you're going to see litigation or insurance claims or regulatory action over, I think that's what you need to focus on, or risks to human safety and health, right? If that's something that's in concern to your business, like you get in OT. I remember when I did the business risk register for that company I was in manufacturing, like our number one risk on the risk register was loss of human life.
Sure.
Like just straight up, that's the top one. You were not going to come up by that one. And the second was loss of confidentiality in terms of prioritization.
Right.
And again, because if you're in manufacturing, the thing that people want to steal is either your process for making stuff, because that sure makes stuff cheaper,
Yeah.
or to steal your plans for actually the stuff that you're making,
Yeah.
which, not to name names, but China's doing a pretty brisk market at that and re-merchandising our own plans back to us than saying, oh yeah, we came up with this. No, they didn't. It was either forced technology transfer or it was just straight up corporate espionage of actually stealing of plans.
Yeah.
But those became our two top risks that we orient around. And I think if companies don't do that and they just trust some generic consultancy or goodness help us generative AI to come up with an AI, a risk register, it's not tailored for the business, and you're not going to select appropriate controls or even get buy-in for why you need to manage those risks.
Yeah, and coming back to what you said a minute ago about the CISOs that lost their job because they got or they weren't able to get hired because they had a breach or whatever. I think that's a problem in the communication and a problem of the justification of the risk and classification. Right? Is our goal is not zero. Right? Our goal is not, the expectation is not that we're never going to be attacked. It shouldn't be, right? And I think there was a time, especially on the cyber side, where especially the vendors were pushing like, well, you shouldn't be, go for zero. And we do that on safety. The risk register for safety, it was always safety zero. Like no acceptable lost life is acceptable. Like we need to do everything in our power that, coming from power generation, like that was always every meeting we started with a safety moment. It didn't matter if it was an accounting meeting, 3 miles away from the plant, it was still led with a safety meeting. Right. And that was acceptable. And the business was okay with, and the money and all the effort that it took to do safety zero. You can't expect zero on everything because of the cost and everything else. So if you are saying zero, then you have to make sure that you have the appropriate level of funding and spending and people and all the process people and technology to do those things. Unfortunately, what I see happen is they say they want zero, but they have a budget for not zero.
And that's also where I think businesses these days need to start thinking about resiliency.
Right.
Like you're going to get hit.
Yeah.
Breaches are going to happen. I think of data breaches these days like tornadoes, right? Like you can build your manufacturing plant in a place that has the occasional tornado. You can build to the correct code. You can build to the correct spec. You can make sure that there are places for people to shelter in place. And then there are alarm and notification systems. You are not stopping a tornado.
Right. Yeah.
Right. This tornado is going to happen. The question becomes, after the fact, could you prove to an insurance investigator, to law enforcement? Now, let's say that's not a tornado. Let's say that's ransomware.
Right.
Let's say that's an OT attack, right, to actually degrade system quality. Same problem, right? The thing happened.
Yep.
How well did your organization recover from it? And did you have a defensible strategy for planning for pending litigation associated with that? Or were you just down in the business gubbins of how do we actually do recovery without that consideration? And you think, well, we'll just, send the breach report over to our counsel and hope that's going to be fine. We'll just YOLO it, because that's, I don't think that's ever turned out well for folks.
Yeah.
But that does tend to be one of those, again, it's a lack of communication between chief legal officer and the CISO around how will we handle resiliency matters when a bad thing happens. How are we going to ensure we've both got the legitimate business process of incident response and remediation, and then the second track of legal response, so that if there is going to be a pending action that happens as a consequence, right, that we are covered against that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that simple but hard communication and understanding and thinking about these things. And it goes into, you should be having these conversations, going through tabletop exercises, getting the right people in the meetings, having these conversations. So, hey, if this happens, what would be our response? Have we thought about this? Like when that tornado comes through, how are we going to recover? Where are we going to send people? Who's going to come back? So we did a simple tabletop for folks not too long ago. And it was a simple 9-step, tabletop exercise, but it was simple things like, hey, this happens. Somebody throws a smoke bomb and they pull a fire alarm. And then who do you send back in after that smoke alarm? Do you send in your cybersecurity people? Do you send in your, just little things like that? And it's surprising how few people have gone through this thought exercise before. Well, we should pull power. We should send in our cyber people, but you don't know it's safe yet. So you would send in an IT guy before you knew that it was safe to send anybody in? No, you should probably send in first responders. It's just going through little things like that. But after they've had that conversation, it's like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. Of course I wouldn't send my geek squad in to fix the problem before I knew it was safe to send anybody in.
Yeah, and I do love that you've brought tabletops into the conversation, because one of the things I used to do and I've done tabletops for years now, always you start at the lowest level, the actual incident response people,
Right.
but at some people you have to bring in the executives, and you have to bring in crisis comms, and you have to bring in like whatever their plan is from marketing or from sales or
Right.
from the CFO, the CEO. And the reason that I do that was kind of twofold. One was to see how well the information transferred from a technical person to a non-technical person, and the other one was to figure out, to say it bluntly, to make sure they weren't going to pull a Hayward. And if you don't know who Tony Hayward is, right, he had a bit of a moment in the media, and it's now taught in business schools, because he just wanted to get back to his life.
Yep.
And never mind what happened on the Gulf Coast with the Deepwater Horizon. Finding that level of communications, just because you've got a CEO doesn't mean they necessarily need to be the mouthpiece for like, here's how we're dealing with this data breach.
Right.
And it's also not necessarily counsel, who will sometimes over rotate it and say, hypothetically, something happened without any specific material guidance.
Yeah.
So I think that tabletopping for that is really an essential skill, and whether that's an internal skill, which, I keep this on my desk. I like it so much. Backdoors and
Yep.
Breaches card game. It's fantastic. If you don't own a copy, I'm not selling it, but please do go get yourself a copy. Give it to your IR team. But also doing an external one where you get that different perspective of what would happen in the case of this. Are we thinking through the technical aspects, the legal aspects, the regulatory aspects, the insurance aspects? Because if you don't go through that once at least, you don't know how your other executive team members and incident responders are going to actually operate in a crisis. And that's not somewhere you want to be,
No.
right? I think if you're thinking towards resiliency, people have done this together in a collaborative, non-adversarial fashion before they do it live, because you will be doing this live, and that's not a fatalistic view of cybersecurity. That's just our modern reality of things are going to happen. If we can be calm and cool and collected and get our way through it, as opposed to losing our minds and having our hair on fire, we're going to have a lot better outcomes.
Well, full circle back to what you originally talked about fire. Why are we so successful in how we deal with fire? Because we go through these practices. On Thursday, we're going to set the alarm off, and everybody's going to go through the motions like there's a fire, and we're going to evacuate. We're going to go to the muster point. Where does everybody go? That's why we're successful in fire, because we've been doing this as all the way from when I was a kid in grade school to as an adult at a business in a building, right? We always do these tabletops or these exercises to practice it, because you don't want to be the first time that you're going through it is when there's smoke. Like, that's not when you want to be running through it, because then everybody's running around, they don't know where to go, and they're screaming and they're panicking. But if I've done this, it's like, oh yeah, I remember. I go to the stairwell, I don't use the elevator, we go to this muster point, make sure nobody's left behind. Don't take my stuff, just leave, evacuate. We go through these steps because it's not the first time we've done it.
Yeah. That's a very good analogy. I think I might borrow that one actually about fire drills, although I'm not sure with work from home if that's still so much of a thing.
That's true.
But for people who are working from the offices, that totally is a great analogy to use.
Yeah, absolutely. So all this that we've said, lots of good and scary and crazy. The next 5 to 10 years, what's one thing that maybe that you're excited about that's coming over the horizon, and maybe something that you're a little concerned about that's coming up over the horizon?
So the thing I'm probably most excited about is one of my kids is going to be graduating college in a cybersecurity degree program, and in Washington State, the nice thing is that instead of doing high school, you can actually just go straight to college. And it's basically paid for mostly by the state, like the actual tuition and admissions fees.
Wow.
And the interesting thing about this, because they got into cybersecurity because years ago they used to do my Twitter imagery when I used to post statistics images to Twitter.
Sure.
This was a way that they could do an internship and get allowances. I think like a 10-year-old or something. And then we made the great mistake of putting parental control software on their devices, and they figured out they really liked working around that. And that went, oh, well, wait a second. You're saying that I could do 2 years of college and I can get a middle-class income and have a job that might be interesting. And then the interesting part that came out of it, and the reason I'm excited about this, is not that that's their career goal.
Sure.
They said, and this is a different perspective on a profession that I hadn't considered. Like, so if I go to college and I don't have any student loan debt coming out of that, and I'm making a middle class income and the work sucks, after 2 years, I will have enough banked that I can go back to college and not have any student loan debt. And I think that's kind of a selling point that we have all collectively missed associated with our profession, where, we think of how do we retain people for an extended period of time. For some people, if they just get in, make money, and get out after a couple of years, they're first of all going to be better corporate employees because they'll have an appreciation of security and risk management. But also, wow, that's a great way of avoiding student loan debt, which as a parent I can say I am 100% in favor of.
I agree.
In terms of something that's scary, I think that a lack of regulatory controls around generative artificial intelligence. I think with the president's recent executive order, we've started to see at least a glimmer that there's something happening there. Inclusion of the DPA, the Defense Production Act, is sort of an interesting one around safety requirements. I do like that they have the idea that if we were to watermark generative stuff, audio, video, images, that it's going to potentially reduce harm. I think the challenge associated with that is all the threat actors are not going to update their models to include a watermark to say, hey, this is being brought to you by Russia.
Right.
I don't think that's the way the world works. There's certainly going to be a market in non-Western nations that will be for tools that will specifically generate deep fakes for purposes that are, not legal under our laws, but legal certainly in other jurisdictions. And I think that lack of regulatory controls or over-rotating into those, both of those are kind of scary, because generative AI, at least for when it comes to and artificial intelligence in general, for cybersecurity has the premise of reducing some of the manual tasks that we have to do, whether that's review of logs to try and find the needle in the needle stack that actually is the red thread to pull on, or whether it's automating our compliance operations so that we can generate evidence of our compliance, like that routine stuff. I think we can take that out of people's hands necessarily, because it's not fun and nobody really gets excited in the morning. I'm going to go do that all day. But at the same time, it has a massive risk of societal harm, where if done poorly, if we don't decide to manage the economic impacts of artificial intelligence, potentially a lot of industries could be at least partially automated. And that has the potential for a lot of social harm, where people just don't have jobs. And when you get people who are automated out of a job, what are they going to go do? They're going to do something that everybody can do fine, but it doesn't pay well. Like, you end up going and driving for a living or doing deliveries for a living. And you end up with a highly educated workforce that is unhappy. That's like a recipe right there for civil unrest. So hopefully this executive order and future pending regulatory controls, both in the United States as well as in the UK and the EU, will help to address some of that and have a sensible approach towards this technology, rather than automate everything and welcome our new robot overlords.
That's right. Yeah, it's definitely on everybody's mind, right? You hear about it in the news, you see it in products, you see it, everybody talking about it, and it's just like anything, right? Is we have to understand what we're getting into, and I don't think very many people really can grasp how much of a difference maker this thing can be, and how quickly it can get out of hand, where there's no way to come back from. And not to fire and brimstone, but that it's definitely something that I'm concerned about as well. I have 3 kids as well, and mine are younger, but still, like, what are they going to do, and are they going to have employment and a society to grow up in and become what they want to be and be happy, healthy humans, which is ultimately, I think, what. If you raise it away from the cyber risk and you just look at the overall risk, right? That's what we want. Like, we all want that happy, capable humans that can go on about their lives and do whatever it is that they want to do, right? So awesome. Well, thank you so much, sir. Anything you want, the call to action for people to listen to, get a hold of you? You're going to be speaking, anything like that?
Sure. So I'd say follow me on LinkedIn if you want to know what I'm up to these days. I know I'm speaking, I think, in Columbus, Ohio in November. So if you happen to be out that way at the GPSec event, I'll be speaking there. And as well, I'd encourage you to follow Hyperproof on LinkedIn as well as on YouTube, because you can see our latest show, InfoSec Pros, where I'm doing interviews with some of the most interesting people I've actually met in cybersecurity. We do one interview a month. It might soon switch to be two. Or alternatively, if you want to see me make terrible faces while trying beer, do suggest beers for me to try on Drafting Compliance, which is our show where we talk about FedRAMP and we drink beer. Tom, my co-host, loves beer. I, on the other hand, have not found anything tolerable, though we are still searching for something that's at least not going to make me grimace. But that's it. Yeah, definitely do follow Hyperproof on LinkedIn and YouTube, and check us out at hyperproof.io. And on LinkedIn, I'm just Kayne McGladrey. There's only one of me. Thanks, Mom and Dad, for making that really easy for people to find me.
Awesome. Well, we'll put all those links in the show notes so everybody can find you. Thank you again for your time today, sir. I look forward to future conversations with you. It was great this time.
Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast. If you got some valuable information from today's show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Aaron and to get your free copy of the OT Cybersecurity Solution Buyer's Guide, go to industrialdefender.com. That's industrialdefender.com, or you can click the link in the show notes.